It only takes one ordinary night to change everything. One ride accepted without hesitation. One moment of trust given too easily. One decision that feels harmless at the time but echoes forever. On the surface, it looks like just another weekend story, the kind that starts with laughter, music, and the idea that tomorrow will come just like it always does. But some nights don't end with memories. Some nights become questions that never stop being asked. The evening began like so many others, with the simple excitement that comes from being young, free, and surrounded by friends, when the world still feels wide open and full of promise. There was no sense of danger in the air, no warning sign that anything strange or harmful was waiting ahead. It was just another night shaped by conversation, shared plans, familiar faces, and the comforting belief that everyone would arrive home safely. In settings like these, nothing feels threatening because everything feels familiar. The music is familiar, the streets are familiar, the people seem familiar enough to trust. That's what makes moments like this so haunting in hindsight, how normal they felt while unfolding, how unremarkable every step seemed until it was too late to go back. The night moved forward in fragments, brief conversations, short rides, moments that barely registered as important at the time. And yet, those small moments were quietly building toward a turning point no one could yet see. What investigators would later unravel was not a sudden act of chaos, but a series of ordinary movements stitched together in a way that led somewhere no one expected. As the hours ticked by, decisions were made quickly, casually, without fear in their wake. Someone offered a ride. Someone accepted. Someone trusted that the people around them would act with care. Trust, in moments like these, doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. The idea that something could go wrong barely crosses the mind when the night still feels young and the road ahead still feels safe. From the outside, the sequence of events looks simple. From the inside, it felt like nothing at all was happening. Laughter masked uncertainty. Movement replaced reflection. And time kept passing without stopping to warn anyone what it was carrying forward. Later, investigators would review timelines, phone records, and scattered witness accounts, searching for the exact moment when the path shifted from safe to dangerous. But in real life, there is rarely a clear dividing line. There is no loud alarm that signals when a situation has quietly become unsafe. There are only choices made in real time, without the benefit of hindsight. As the night continued, those choices stacked upon one another, not with bad intentions visible at the surface, but with consequences that couldn't yet be imagined. What makes this story so unsettling is not just what happened, but how easily it could have been mistaken for just another forgettable night out. It's the reminder that tragedy doesn't always announce itself with fear or chaos. Sometimes it slips in quietly, hidden behind normality, carried by routine, and protected by the assumption that nothing bad ever happens until it does. By the time concern entered the picture, the night was already moving into its final hours, and the ordinary had already begun to quietly unravel into something no one could undo. By the time concern entered the picture, the night was already moving into its final hours, and the ordinary had already begun to quietly unravel into something no one could undo. The roads were darker now, quieter, the kind of silence that only appears when most of the city is gone to sleep and only a few distant lights remain flickering in shop windows and street lamps. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere felt uncertain in ways that are hard to describe after the fact. Nothing openly alarming, nothing dramatic enough to demand immediate action, just a growing sense that the night was shifting into unfamiliar territory. Conversations that once felt easy became shorter. The rhythm of movement changed as routes turned less familiar and landmarks disappeared into shadow. What had begun as a simple journey toward home now stretched longer than expected, with detours that felt unnecessary but went unquestioned in the moment. It's often in these quiet transitions, these uneventful stretches of time, that danger hides most effectively, because nothing feels urgent enough to resist. Each passing minute felt small and unimportant on its own, yet together they carried everything forward. Later, investigators would trace these final movements with precise timestamps and reconstructed routes, breaking down every turn and stop in an effort to understand not just where the night went, but how it slipped so gradually out of control. In the moment, though, there was no investigation, no flashing lights, no sense of crisis, only movement through space and time, guided by assumptions that would later be questioned again and again. Somewhere along that route, vulnerability quietly intensified, not through force, not through sudden confrontation, but through isolation and disorientation. The sense of safety that had existed at the start of the night no longer felt solid, but it also didn't feel fully gone. It lingered in uncertainty, suspended between trust and doubt. When the vehicle finally stopped in a place that felt unfamiliar and exposed, the silence grew heavier. What happened in those moments would become the center of a case that shocked a community and rippled far beyond it. But at the time, it was just another stop on a dark road, another short pause in a night that was supposed to be ending, not changing forever. Later, different accounts would emerge, layered with contradictions, confusion, and unanswered questions. Each retelling would attempt to explain what no single explanation could fully capture: the complexity of human behavior under pressure and the blurred line between awareness and misjudgment. When the night finally gave way to morning, the world woke up unaware that something irreversible had already taken place. Somewhere, a family was still asleep, expecting a normal day to begin. Somewhere, messages went unanswered. Somewhere, worry began quietly forming, not yet knowing what it was truly responding to. The discovery that followed would not arrive with immediate clarity, but with disbelief, shock, and a wave of confusion that spread faster than answers could follow. For first responders and investigators, the scene raised questions that would not resolve easily. For loved ones, it shattered the idea that this was just another weekend story. The hours that followed would be filled with desperate attempts to understand how a night that began so normally could end with such devastating consequences. Community members searched for familiar details to hold on to: what time the person was last seen, who they were with, where the last message was sent. Each detail became a fragile thread of connection to someone who should have been returning home, not becoming the subject of an investigation. As news spread, the narrative shifted from concern to heartbreak, from uncertainty to collective grief. And yet, alongside grief came the demand for answers. People wanted to know what truly happened during those final hours, what decisions were made, who had the chance to intervene, and how a sequence of ordinary moments could collapse into irreversible loss. Investigators would later emphasize how quickly circumstances evolved, how the margin between safety and danger narrowed in ways that are difficult to detect until it is already closed. In interviews, experts would speak about vulnerability, impaired judgment, missed opportunities for help, and the silent risks that often accompany late-night travel. Each explanation, no matter how logical, felt painfully inadequate in the face of a life cut short and a future erased. As the case moved forward, attention turned not only to what happened, but to what could have been different. Could a call have been made sooner? Could a different decision have altered the outcome? Could awareness have changed the course of that night? These questions would echo in courtrooms, in media coverage, and in private conversations among families and friends who saw their own lives reflected in the story. The tragedy forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, safety, and how quickly circumstances can change when vigilance fades. What made the loss even heavier was the realization that nothing about the night initially stood out as dangerous. It followed patterns that countless people follow every weekend without incident. That familiarity is what makes the story so deeply unsettling, because it suggests how close such tragedy can be to ordinary life, how thin the boundary can feel between routine and disaster. As the investigation continued, every detail was treated not as a mere statistic, but as a piece of a deeply human story shaped by youth, movement, misjudgment, and irreversible consequence. And as the legal process unfolded, the story shifted once again, no longer just about what happened that night, but about accountability, responsibility, and the long shadow that a few hours can cast over an entire lifetime. And as the legal process unfolded, the story shifted once again, no longer just about what happened that night, but about accountability, responsibility, and the long shadow that a few hours can cast over an entire lifetime. Courtrooms became the new setting where fragments of the final hours were carefully reassembled through testimony, digital records, and expert analysis. Every message timestamp, every movement logged by surveillance, every statement given under oath became a piece of a timeline the public tried desperately to understand. For the family, each hearing reopened wounds that never had the chance to heal. Grief was no longer a private experience. It became something examined, debated, and scrutinized under harsh courtroom lights. The legal language often felt cold in contrast to the emotional weight behind every detail, yet it was the only path toward answers that the system could offer. Outside the courtroom, the community watched closely, following every update with a mixture of hope and heartbreak, wanting reassurance that the truth would not be lost amid argument and delay. The case sparked wider conversations about safety, responsibility, and how quickly young lives can be placed in irreversible danger. Parents held their children a little tighter, friends checked in more often, social media filled with reminders, warnings, and calls for awareness, all driven by the same haunting realization. This could have been anyone's night. As weeks turned into months, attention shifted from shock to determination. Advocates emerged determined that this loss would not fade into silence. They spoke about prevention, awareness, and the importance of speaking up before quiet uncertainty turns into irreversible regret. Educational discussions began appearing in schools and universities, not framed in fear but in awareness, reminding young people that decisions made in vulnerable moments can carry lifelong weight. The story became more than a single case. It became a symbol of how quickly circumstances can spiral, and how essential it is to look out for one another when instincts signal something isn't right. Meanwhile, the investigation pressed forward, slow and methodical, bound by procedure rather than urgency. Authorities emphasized that justice is not driven by speed but by accuracy, a statement that offered little comfort to those waiting for closure, but underscored the seriousness of the process. Behind closed doors, legal teams prepared arguments that would shape how responsibility was defined and how the final hours would be interpreted. Every version of events was tested against physical evidence, expert analysis, and conflicting recollections. Memory, already fragile under stress, became a battlefield of contradictions. What one person recalled with certainty, another disputed entirely. In these gaps between accounts, the pain of uncertainty grew heavier. The family lived suspended between what they knew and what they still needed confirmed. Each court date carried the weight of possibility, either of progress or of another delay that stretched grief further across time. The waiting became its own burden, a slow test of endurance that few outside similar circumstances can fully comprehend. As details of the case reached a wider audience, national attention followed. Media coverage brought pressure, scrutiny, and sometimes misinformation, forcing loved ones to navigate grief while correcting rumors and defending the reality of who this person was beyond headlines. They spoke not of a case, but of a daughter, a friend, a student with plans, humor, ambition, and warmth that could never be summarized by a single tragic night. In doing so, they reminded the public that true crime stories are not entertainment for those living inside them. They are permanent fractures in real families. With time, the narrative matured. It became less about shock and more about systemic reflection. How are young people protected in moments of vulnerability? What responsibility exists beyond personal choice? How do communities respond when warning signs appear subtle rather than dramatic? These questions didn't arrive with neat answers, but they reshaped how the story was understood. What once felt like an isolated tragedy began to resemble a broader cautionary tale about intervention, hesitation, and the silent dangers that exist when no one feels fully responsible. As the legal process moved closer to resolution, emotions intensified rather than settled. Hope for accountability intertwined with fear of disappointment.
The possibility of verdicts carried enormous emotional weight. No outcome could truly restore what was lost, yet every outcome would shape how the loss was remembered. When statements were finally given, they reflected not only grief, but exhaustion, the kind that only comes from carrying unanswered questions for too long. Words spoken in court echoed far beyond the room itself, resonating with anyone who had followed the story from the beginning. In the end, the case left behind more than records, rulings, and headlines. It left behind a transformed family, a cautious community, and a lasting reminder of how fragile safety can be when the night feels ordinary and choices feel small. Long after the proceedings concluded, the lessons continued quietly through conversations, community programs, and moments of hesitation that might not have existed before. The story, though rooted in loss, became a source of awareness that extended forward instead of fading away. It reminded people that vigilance doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's a simple call, a moment of trust questioned, or the courage to interrupt discomfort before it becomes irreversible. And while justice can offer accountability, it cannot return time, rewrite decisions, or restore futures interrupted too soon. What it can do, at best, is draw a firm line between right and wrong, and offer a measure of clarity where confusion once dominated. For those left behind, life continues in two timelines, the one before that night and the one that began afterward. Some days are shaped by memory, others by the effort to build something meaningful from loss. And in quiet moments, when the noise of public attention has finally faded, there remains only the enduring truth that a single night changed everything, and that awareness, once gained at such a cost, now carries the responsibility to protect others from the same silent descent into tragedy. If you want to stay informed about real-life investigations and true crime stories, subscribe now.